Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, and Marcus Wellington stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with a tumbler of 25-year-old scotch, watching the city pulse below him like the heart of some mechanical god. At 53 years old, he had orchestrated 17 corporate acquisitions, built a real estate empire spanning 3 states, and accumulated enough wealth to live 10 lifetimes without working a single day more. Yet, standing here, in a room that cost more monthly in maintenance than most Americans earned in a year, he felt profoundly, achingly empty. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Silver hair perfectly trimmed, tailored charcoal suit, the kind of composed expression that had graced the cover of Forbes twice. Behind him, the apartment was a masterpiece of minimalist design. Marble floors that reflected light like water, abstract art selected by a decorator he'd never met, furniture that prioritized aesthetics over comfort. It was a museum dedicated to his own success, and he could not remember the last time he'd felt happy in it. The sound of the elevator chimed. Victoria was home early. Marcus turned, composing his face into something welcoming, something that resembled a husband greeting his wife. She emerged from the private elevator in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 designer heels clicking against the marble with mechanical precision. Her blonde hair was arranged in the kind of perfection that required $200 and a standing appointment every Friday. At 49, she looked younger, not naturally, but through the disciplined application of dermatologists, personal trainers, and the kind of determination that transformed self-preservation into a full-time occupation. "Darling," she said, offering her cheek for a kiss rather than her lips. Such had been their greeting for approximately 7 years. "The Carmichaels are hosting a gala next month. Black tie. I've already told them we're attending." "Of course," Marcus said, because refusal had never been an option in their carefully constructed life. Victoria moved past him to the bar, pouring herself a glass of Perrier with lime, the beverage of choice for a woman who monitored her alcohol intake the way some people monitored their stock portfolios. "I saw your mother yesterday at the club. She looks well. She asked about Thanksgiving. What did you tell her?" "That we'd likely spend it in Aspen, as usual, though I'm considering St. Bart's this year instead. The Caribbean is so much warmer in November." Marcus nodded, saying nothing. The specifics of their holidays were determined months in advance by Victoria's social calendar, which was synchronized with the calendars of approximately 200 other women in their income bracket, all of them following an invisible script written generations ago. He had married Victoria because she was beautiful, accomplished, and suitable, the kind of woman a man in his position was expected to marry. They had done everything right. The engagement at the Plaza, the wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral with 400 guests, the honeymoon in Paris, the careful production of their lives for an audience that existed primarily in society pages, and the conversations of people they barely liked. But somewhere between the first anniversary and the 15th, they had become strangers who shared an address. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said quietly. Victoria turned, her expression shifting into the pleasant mask of concern that she'd perfected over decades. "Are you ill? Is this about your blood pressure again? I told you to speak to Dr. Feldman about—" "No, I'm fine. It's nothing like that." He paused, gathering the words he'd been rehearsing for weeks. "I read something yesterday, an article about an experiment, a social experiment in Portland, a couple who decided to live on the streets for a week to test the authenticity of their relationship, to see if they could reconnect when stripped of all their money and status." Victoria's nose wrinkled slightly, as though he'd described something unsanitary. How utterly maudlin! Why would anyone intentionally subject themselves to such degradation? "Because," Marcus said slowly, "I think we might be degrading ourselves in a different way. I think we've become performances. We perform for our friends, for society, for each other, and I'm not sure anymore if there's anything real underneath." For a moment, Victoria was silent. Then she laughed, a polished, practiced sound, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Marcus, you're being theatrical. This is what happens when you spend too much time reading articles instead of focusing on acquisitions. We're fine. We have a beautiful life. We have a beautiful apartment," he corrected, "and a beautiful life as a concept. But I'm not sure we have an actual life together anymore." Victoria set down her water glass with deliberate care, a gesture that indicated she was shifting into her serious conversation mode, the one she'd employed when discussing renovations to their Connecticut estate or the proper age at which one's children should attend boarding school. "If you're suggesting we see a therapist, I'll call Dr. Ashford. She has an opening on Tuesdays, but I won't have us washing our dirty laundry in some public exhibition like that couple in Portland." "Not a therapist," Marcus said. "An experiment. Like Portland, but here. 1 week. We take only what we can carry. We live on the streets. We figure out if there's anything worth saving between us." Victoria stared at him as though he'd suggested they take up heroin. "Absolutely not." "Why not?" Marcus pressed, feeling a strange energy rising in his chest, something that felt almost like hope. "What are you afraid of?" "I'm not afraid," Victoria said crisply. "I'm practical, and what I'm hearing is that you're in the grip of some kind of midlife crisis. Perhaps you're working too hard. Perhaps you need a vacation, but I won't participate in some ridiculous social experiment that would humiliate us both." Marcus had expected this response. What he hadn't expected was the clarity with which he suddenly understood that she was right, and that it didn't matter. He was going to do this with or without her. He was going to strip away everything and see what remained. And if what remained was nothing, if he discovered that the man underneath the Italian suits and the corner office was as hollow as the penthouse suggested, then at least he would know. "I'm doing this," he said quietly. "I thought I wanted you to come with me. I thought it might save us. But I realize now that I'm doing this to save myself." Victoria's face hardened into something unreadable. "If you leave this apartment without me, if you humiliate this family with some kind of public stunt, I will divorce you. I will take half of everything, and I will spend the next decade ensuring that everyone we know understands exactly why." It was delivered without anger or drama, simply as a statement of fact, the way one might announce that it was raining. And yet, Marcus realized with a startling sense of liberation, it no longer frightened him. The threat that had implicitly governed their marriage for 15 years had finally been spoken aloud, and in being spoken, had lost its power. "I know," he said. "I've already spoken to my lawyers." 3 days later, Marcus stood in Grand Central Terminal with 2 canvas suitcases, each containing approximately $75,000 in mixed bills. He'd withdrawn the money in small increments over the course of a month, converting it to a random assortment of denominations so as not to trigger any banking alerts. The money wasn't the point, or rather, it was the point in a way that he was still trying to clarify in his own mind. The money was evidence that this was real, that he wasn't some romantic fool on a weekend adventure. He could buy his way out of this whenever he wanted. He was choosing not to. The morning was grey and cold, the kind of late October weather that turned Manhattan's humidity into something sharp and biting. Marcus had dressed carefully for this new life. Dark jeans without designer labels, a black sweater with actual wear visible in the cuffs, sneakers that had been scuffed deliberately on concrete. He'd paid a barber in Queens to give him a haircut that was slightly too long, slightly too unkempt. He'd allowed 2 days of stubble to shadow his jaw. The effect was not quite homeless. He had the bone structure and the posture of a man who'd never missed a meal, but he was closer to the world he was about to enter than he'd been to it in 30 years. He'd left a note for Victoria on the marble kitchen counter, weighted down by a diamond cufflink he'd inherited from his grandfather. "I'm doing this with or without you. If you choose to come, I will wait for you at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge at noon tomorrow. I will have one suitcase. If you're not there, I'll understand, but I hope you'll come. I think we might find something real in the rubble of everything we've built. He had not expected her to come. He'd actually prepared himself for the certainty of her refusal. Which was why, when she appeared at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge the next day, dressed in black jeans and a wool coat, her face stripped of makeup, her blonde hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. She looked, he realized, like a woman who was actually cold, rather than a woman who had been designed to appear cold. She looked like someone he might actually want to know. "This is insane," she said without preamble, her breath visible in the October air. "If we're doing this, we're doing it properly. I spoke to a woman at the shelter, a real shelter. Not some aesthetic version we can leave whenever we want. They have beds, they have rules. We start there." Marcus nodded slowly. "You've already decided?" "I've decided," Victoria said, and there was something in her voice that he hadn't heard in years. Not anger, not performed concern, but genuine uncertainty. "I don't know if I believe in your experiment. I don't know if I think it will fix anything. But I know that if I don't come, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering, and I'm tired of wondering about things. I'm tired of not knowing." That evening, they checked into the Sunrise shelter in the Bronx, surrendering their suitcases to a locked storage closet and receiving 2 narrow beds in a room with 14 other women. The beds were plastic-coated, the blankets thin and institutional. The woman in the bed next to Victoria snored. The lighting was fluorescent and never quite turned off. And somewhere in the darkness, Marcus realized that this was real in a way his penthouse had never been. This was the moment the old life ended, and whatever came next began. The shelter's morning routine began at 5:45 with the institutional clang of a bell that sounded less like an alarm and more like a warning. Marcus jerked awake on his plastic mattress, disoriented for the first 7 seconds, expecting the Egyptian cotton sheets of the penthouse, the soft hum of the climate control system, the muted sounds of the city filtered through triple-glazed windows. Instead, he found himself in a room lit by the grey dawn of a Bronx October, surrounded by the sounds of 8 women moving through the cramped space, with the efficiency of people who had learned to navigate confined spaces without disturbing one another. He sat up slowly, his neck stiff from the thin pillow, and looked across the narrow aisle toward Victoria's bed. She was already awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling tile directly above her head. She hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged his movement. In the weak morning light, he could see the way her jaw was clenched, the way her hands gripped the institutional blanket. She looked like a woman bracing for impact. The shelter's bathroom was a corridor of 6 toilet stalls and 4 shower enclosures, all of them in use within minutes of the morning bell. Marcus waited his turn, standing against the cinder block wall, watching the parade of women in various states of preparation. A young black woman with intricate braids applied makeup with meticulous care, as though she were preparing for an important interview rather than another day of survival. An older Latina woman brushed her teeth with a methodical rhythm that suggested decades of routine in spaces like this. A tall white woman with track marks visible on her inner arms stood under a cold shower, not flinching, as though she'd transcended the capacity to feel temperature. When it was his turn, the water ran lukewarm at best, and the soap was industrial and unscented. Marcus showered quickly, acutely aware that he was taking space from people who might need hot water more desperately than he did. It was a strange sensation, guilt attached to basic hygiene. At the penthouse, he'd never considered the resources his comfort consumed. Here, every gallon of hot water felt like a theft. By 6:30, everyone had cycled through their morning routines, and the shelter's dining area, a space that managed to be simultaneously cavernous and claustrophobic, filled with residents queuing for breakfast. The food was utilitarian, scrambled eggs that had been cooked hours earlier and left to congealed, toast with margarine, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the Bush administration. Marcus took a plate and a cup and found Victoria sitting at one of the long institutional tables, her shoulders slightly hunched, her eyes moving across the room with the careful attention of someone cataloguing exits and potential threats. He sat across from her without speaking. Words felt dangerous somehow, as though they might shatter the fragile equilibrium they'd established by simply showing up to this place. "The woman next to me last night," Victoria said quietly, not looking at him, "has been living here for 4 months. She lost her job as an office manager when her company downsized. She's been trying to find work, but landlords won't rent to her without a permanent address, and employers won't hire her without a permanent address. She's trapped in a loop. She showed me her resume. It's excellent, Marcus. Better than half the people we know. She just needed one person to take a chance on her." Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing this as what it was. Not a criticism exactly, but a reckoning, a way of saying that the world looked different from this side of the mirror. "What's her name?" he asked. "Diane," Victoria said. "She's 52. They finished breakfast in silence. At 7 o'clock, the shelter's director, a woman named Patricia with grey dreadlocks and the manner of someone who had seen too much kindness and too much cruelty to be surprised by either, gathered the residents in the main room to discuss the day's protocols. "You've got until 9 o'clock to grab your belongings if you're staying at another facility," Patricia said, her voice carrying the particular timbre of someone who'd given this speech 1,000 times. "If you're staying with us again tonight, bed assignments are posted on the board. Dinner is at 5:30. Curfew is 9 o'clock sharp. Lights out at 9:30. Anyone found under the influence will be asked to leave. Anyone who causes problems will be asked to leave. Anyone who harasses another resident will be asked to leave. We got rules here, and the rules exist so that everyone can feel safe. This is your space, and you got to treat it like it matters." Marcus noticed that several people were nodding, as though Patricia had just articulated something fundamental, as though safety were not a given, but an achievement. The question became, what next? The shelter expected residents to vacate during the day, to pursue employment or services, or at minimum, to move through the world rather than occupy space. Marcus had approximately $75,000 in 2 suitcases locked in a storage closet, but spending that money defeated the purpose of the experiment. He and Victoria were meant to navigate this week as actual homeless people did, with cunning, luck, and whatever resources they could access without revealing their true identity. "We need jobs," Victoria said, once they were outside the shelter, standing on a street corner in the Bronx that looked utterly unfamiliar to both of them. The buildings were all 6 stories or fewer, painted in fading pastels, covered with graffiti that ranged from gang tags to surprisingly sophisticated murals. The street smelled like exhaust and something acrid, burning plastic perhaps, or cooking oil. Everything felt intentionally hostile to the idea of comfort. "Temporary day labor," Marcus said, thinking aloud. "There are companies that hire people by the day. We could find one, work 8 hours, earn enough for food and maybe a hotel room." Victoria pulled out her phone. They'd decided to keep one device for emergencies, with a generic prepaid plan under an assumed name, and started searching. Within 15 minutes, they'd identified 3-day labor agencies within a 15-minute bus ride. The bus itself was an adventure. They had to figure out how to pay, had to request directions from a driver who clearly dealt with confused tourists all day and had no patience for the distinction between confused and simply unprepared for urban transit. But they managed it, and by 8 o'clock they were standing in a warehouse-like space in Queens, surrounded by approximately 40 other people, all of them waiting to be selected for jobs. The work available was exactly what Marcus had anticipated: manual labor, physical exertion, the kind of employment that required a body rather than a resume. He was assigned to help move furniture out of a commercial office that was relocating. Victoria was assigned to help a woman cleaning residential apartments. They would work 8 hours for $85 each, paid in cash at the end of the day. As Victoria was led away by her supervisor, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, she caught Marcus's gaze. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite pass. Fear, perhaps, or maybe determination, maybe both. The furniture-moving job was, in a word, brutal. Marcus had never considered himself physically weak. He had a personal trainer who came to the penthouse 3 times a week. He played occasional rounds of golf. He maintained the kind of fitness that was expected of a man in his position. But maintaining fitness in climate-controlled environments with water breaks and modern equipment was entirely different from 8 consecutive hours of carrying heavy objects up and down narrow stairwells, while a supervisor named Derek yelled instructions in a Bronx accent so thick it sometimes bordered on incomprehensible. His hands developed blisters by hour 3. By hour 5, his back was screaming in a way that suggested either significant muscle damage or simply the rebellion of muscles that had never been asked to work like this before. By hour 7, he'd stopped thinking about anything except getting to hour 8. The other workers, 3 men in their 20s and 40s respectively, did not engage with him beyond the practical necessities of moving furniture. There was a wordless acknowledgement of his suffering, but no sympathy. In this context, suffering was simply what happened. You endured it, you collected your $85, and you moved on. By the time the job ended at 5 o'clock, Marcus was sweating despite the cool October weather. His muscles trembled with fatigue in a way that felt almost like illness. The supervisor, Derek, handed him $85 in cash, counted out slowly and deliberately, as though the physical act of handing over money required the same effort as the labor itself. "You coming back tomorrow?" Derek asked. Marcus considered the question. Every instinct screamed at him to say no, to retreat, to acknowledge that this had been a mistake, that he should return to the penthouse and resume his life of performance and emptiness. Instead, he heard himself say, "Maybe, depends on what else comes up." Derek nodded, as though this was the answer he'd expected, as though every person who passed through his warehouse was calculating the exact moment at which they would break. Marcus made his way to the meeting point they'd arranged with Victoria. The steps of a public library in Queens, neutral territory, a place where 2 obviously displaced people wouldn't necessarily attract attention. He arrived at 5:45 to find Victoria already there, looking worse than he felt. She had dirt under her fingernails and a smudge of something dark on her left cheek. Her hair, which she'd pulled back into a neat ponytail that morning, had come loose and was hanging in tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. And yet, when she saw him, something that might have been recognition crossed her face. "I cleaned 4 apartments," she said without preamble. 2 of them belonged to people who treated me like I was invisible. 1 belonged to an elderly man who made me tea while I worked. The 4th belonged to a woman who cried. She told me she'd lost her job 3 months ago and that if she didn't find work in the next week, she'd lose her apartment. She tipped me $20 that she probably couldn't afford. Marcus sat down next to her on the library steps. "I moved furniture. It was physically devastating." "How are you feeling?" Victoria asked. "Like I'm dying," Marcus said. "You." "The same." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "But also, I don't know, something different. When the old man made me tea, I actually cried a little bit. Not because I was sad, but because someone was kind to me just to be kind. Because there was no agenda, no social calculation. He just cared for a moment. Marcus looked at his wife. This woman he'd been legally bound to for 15 years, but had genuinely known perhaps not at all, and saw something crack open in his understanding of what this week might actually accomplish. It wasn't about saving the marriage. wasn't about proving that love could survive adversity, wasn't about any of the romantic narratives he'd constructed. It was about being seen, about being treated as a person rather than a symbol, about discovering that the world looked fundamentally different when you were experiencing it from the ground level rather than the penthouse. "We should eat," Victoria said quietly. "We have $170. We should find somewhere affordable." They found a diner near the library, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside the normal economic hierarchy of New York City, where a complete meal with coffee cost under $15. They sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats and ordered the daily special, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and a cup of watered-down gravy. The food was humble and somewhat gelatinous and absolutely delicious. Marcus realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a meal prepared by a human being using ordinary ingredients, rather than a meal assembled by a chef following some conceptual artistic vision. Across from him, Victoria was eating methodically, as though consuming food were a practical matter rather than a social performance. There was no performance here, no careful cutting of portions, no consideration of caloric intake, no worry about how the meal might impact her figure. She was simply hungry, and she was eating. "Tomorrow we should try to find somewhere cheaper to sleep than a hotel," Victoria said. "If we're going to do this week properly, we need to understand what it actually costs to survive. We're bleeding money." "There's a park that has benches," Marcus said, surprising himself. He'd been reading about homelessness, preparing for this experience, consuming information like evidence that might protect him from the actual experience. "Washington Square. We could sleep on benches." Victoria nodded slowly. "We should try that tomorrow." They finished eating and made their way back to the shelter, arriving just before the 9 o'clock curfew. The room was already crowded with women in various states of rest and restlessness. Diane, the woman Victoria had spoken to the previous night, waved them toward empty beds. "How was your day?" Diane asked, her voice kind but carrying the particular empathy of someone who already knew the answer. "Difficult," Victoria said honestly. "My feet hurt. My hands hurt. Everything hurts." "That'll pass," Diane said. "Or it won't. Either way, you get used to it." Marcus lay in his narrow bed, his body aching in ways he'd never experienced, and listened to the sounds of the shelter, the snoring, the coughing, the occasional whisper of conversation, the hum of the fluorescent lights that never quite shut off. Beside him, Victoria was equally awake. He could tell from the quality of her breathing. After approximately 20 minutes of silence, she spoke. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. For a moment, Marcus's heart seized. Was she quitting? Was the experiment over? "I don't want to go back to how we were," Victoria clarified. "I don't know if I can go back to that. It would feel like dying." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then he reached across the narrow space between their beds and found her hand in the darkness. It was cold, and her palms were rough from the day's labor, and it was the most authentic thing he'd felt in 15 years. They left the shelter on the third morning with a specific plan. They would spend the day searching for work, and they would spend the night in Washington Square Park, sleeping on benches like actual homeless people, experiencing the particular vulnerability and exposure that came with having nowhere else to go. Victoria had suggested it, and Marcus had recognized it as a test, not of him, but of herself. She was pushing deeper into this experience, refusing the safety net of the shelter, insisting on authenticity even when it terrified her. The October weather had shifted overnight. A cold front was moving through the city, and the temperature had dropped to the low 50s, cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not yet the bone-deep chill that would come in November. It was, Marcus realized, almost exactly the wrong temperature for sleeping outdoors. Cold enough to prevent comfortable rest, but not cold enough to qualify as an emergency. The perfect temperature for slow, grinding discomfort. They'd eaten a quick breakfast at the shelter, oatmeal that was somehow both lumpy and somehow also gelatinous, and then made their way to a day labor agency in Manhattan, this time in Midtown, the geographic opposite of Queens. The warehouse here was smaller, the workers somewhat different. More women, more people who spoke English as a second language, a greater sense of desperation that seemed to vibrate in the air like a frequency only certain people could perceive. The jobs available were similarly unglamorous. A woman needed help painting an apartment in Washington Heights. A restaurant needed prep work done. A warehouse needed inventory sorted. Marcus took the painting job. Victoria took the restaurant prep work. They separated at 9 o'clock in the morning with a plan to meet at 4 o'clock in Washington Square Park. The painting job was, if possible, worse than the furniture moving. The apartment was in a pre-war building with sloped floors and ancient plumbing, and the woman hiring, a Dominican woman named Rosario, who was renovating the space to increase its rental value, was a perfectionist. Every corner needed to be painted, every edge needed to be clean, every mistake needed to be corrected. By hour 3, Marcus's arm was burning from holding the roller, and by hour 6 he was painting on pure muscle memory and sheer force of will. Rosario, to her credit, had provided him with lunch, arroz con pollo that she'd cooked that morning, warm and savory and actually delicious. She'd sat with him while he ate, not speaking much, but conveying through her presence a kind of solidarity. By the end of the job, she paid him $90, $5 more than the agreed-upon rate, and pressed a container of leftover food into his hands. "You come back tomorrow," she said. "I got more walls. You work good. Careful. I like careful." Marcus thanked her, meaning it, and made his way downtown on the subway, arriving at Washington Square Park just after 4 o'clock. Victoria was already there, sitting on a bench near the center of the park, her shoulders hunched against the cooling air. She'd changed since that morning. The Victoria who'd left the shelter had been composed, determined. This Victoria looked hollowed out. When she saw him, she attempted a smile that didn't quite materialize. "How was it?" Marcus asked, sitting down beside her. "I've never understood why people complain about restaurant work," Victoria said quietly. "I was on my feet for 8 hours, standing in front of a commercial kitchen in early October heat, prepping vegetables, and there was a man, the head chef, who yelled at me because I didn't cut the onions the way he preferred. He actually made me stand there and watch while he demonstrated the correct angle. I'm 49 years old, Marcus. I have a degree from Wellesley, and I was being instructed on how to cut an onion like a child learning to cook for the first time." Marcus recognized this as the moment when the experiment was no longer theoretical. This was the moment when Victoria was confronting the actual contempt that the world reserved for people in her current position. "You know what happened at lunch?" Victoria continued. "The other workers were eating in the break room and they were speaking Spanish. I didn't understand what they were saying, but I could see them looking at me, and I understood the sensation of being the outsider, being the person who doesn't belong. I've spent my entire life being inside, Marcus. I've never truly been on the outside." They sat in silence for a while, watching the park fill with the evening crowd, students, tourists, young professionals on their way home from work. The entire cross-section of humanity that Washington Square Park somehow managed to contain. The fountain at the center of the square shot water into the air, and the light was beginning to soften toward that golden hour that made even the city's roughest edges seem momentarily beautiful. "We should eat," Marcus said finally. "We need to conserve our money, but we also need calories if we're going to sleep outside." They found a bodega and bought sandwiches, turkey and cheese on white bread, nothing fancy, costing $4 each. They found a coffee shop with free bathrooms and used them, understanding implicitly that this would likely be their last opportunity for basic hygiene until the next morning. By 7 o'clock, as the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping further, they made their way to a section of the park that seemed less populated, less observed. The benches in Washington Square Park were deliberately designed to prevent sleeping. They had armrests dividing them into sections, sloped surfaces, metal bars running across the back. Despite this, Homeless people still managed to sleep on them, contorting themselves into positions that looked both impossible and utterly exhausted. Marcus and Victoria found a bench slightly isolated by a cluster of trees and attempted to position themselves in a way that was marginally comfortable. Victoria lay on her side, using her bag as a pillow. Marcus sat upright, leaning against the backrest, his coat pulled around him. The night descended in stages. First, the darkness, a gradual dimming of light as the sky transitioned from blue to purple to black. Then, the cold, a creeping sensation that started in the extremities and slowly invaded the core. Then, the sounds. The city's nighttime symphony of sirens and car horns, the occasional voice calling out, the low murmur of other people sharing the park's shelter. Marcus didn't sleep. Neither, he suspected, did Victoria. They existed instead in a state of semi-consciousness, hyper-aware of every discomfort, every threat, every way in which this bench was not a bed and this park was not a home. At some point, perhaps around 2 in the morning, when the temperature had dropped to its lowest point, Victoria sat up abruptly, shivering violently. "I can't," she whispered. "Marcus, I can't. I'm cold, and I'm scared, and I'm uncomfortable, and I can't do this for an entire night." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. The old Marcus, the Marcus of the penthouse, of the performance, of the carefully maintained distance, would have seen this as validation. "I told you this was a mistake. I knew you couldn't handle it. Let's go back." But the Marcus who'd been emerging over the past 3 days, the Marcus who'd been forced to confront his own softness and privilege and fundamental alienation from the world, recognized something different in his wife's breaking point. This wasn't weakness. This was honesty. "Okay," he said, "okay. We'll go to a hotel, just for tonight. We'll rest, and tomorrow we'll come back." "I'm sorry," Victoria said, and there were tears on her face that looked black in the night. "I thought I could do this. I thought I was stronger than this." "You are strong," Marcus said, and he meant it with a clarity that surprised him. "You're strong enough to admit that you can't do something. There's a difference between strength and stubbornness." They gathered their belongings and made their way out of the park, walking until they found a 24-hour bodega with a clerk who could direct them to a nearby hotel. The Hotel Liberty was a 3-story building that looked like it had been old in 1980 and had been aging continuously since. The room cost $45 for the night, paid in cash, no questions asked. It was small, with water stains on the ceiling, and a smell that suggested a combination of mold and decades of human habitation. There was one bed with a comforter that was probably not currently clean, a television that appeared to be from the 1990s, and a bathroom with a shower that produced water that was simultaneously scalding and ice-cold with no middle ground. And to Marcus it felt like luxury. They stood under that terrible shower together, shivering and then overheating and then shivering again. And for the first time since this week had begun, Victoria laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh, but a genuine laugh of absurdity and relief, and the particular humor that comes from shared suffering. In the bed with the questionable comforter, they lay close together for warmth, and it was in this moment, in this terrible hotel room in a neighborhood neither of them would have previously acknowledged the existence of, that Marcus realized the experiment was working in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't saving the marriage in some dramatic, romantic fashion. It was dismantling the structures that had made the marriage impossible. "I want to tell you something," Victoria said into the darkness. "Something I've never told you before." "Okay," Marcus said. "When we were first married, I loved you," she said quietly. "Genuinely, completely. I was actually happy. But then, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th year, I realized that I was becoming something. Not someone, something. A decoration, a companion. A woman whose job was to enhance your image and provide you with a suitable social context. And I couldn't figure out how to tell you that that was killing me, so I just accepted it. I became the person that was expected of me. I lost myself so gradually that I didn't even notice it happening." Marcus wanted to respond, wanted to defend himself, wanted to say that he'd never intended this. But he remained silent, recognizing that silence was sometimes the only honest response. "I don't know if this week is going to fix anything," Victoria continued, "but I know that it's reminding me that there's a me to recover. I'm not just a woman who wears Chanel and serves on charity boards. I can also be a woman who cleans apartments and sleeps on park benches and laughs at terrible hotels. Both of those things can be true." "Both are true," Marcus said finally. "That's the point. Both can be true." They fell asleep like that, in the terrible hotel room, with their bodies close together for the first time in years, and something fundamental had shifted between them that couldn't be shifted back. The next morning, they woke to the sound of car horns and the particular grey light that filtered through cheap curtains. They had $70 left, the container of food that Rosario had given Marcus, and one more day before they were supposed to return to the penthouse. But the plan had shifted, Victoria announced, over lukewarm coffee from the bodega downstairs. They weren't going back to the penthouse yet. They were going to extend the experiment. "We have money in the suitcases," Victoria said. "We should use it, not to go back to being who we were, but to actually experience what this week would be like if we had slightly more resources. Let's find an apartment, something small and cheap. Let's see if we can create something real." It was a deviation from the original plan, but it was also, Marcus understood, the plan evolving into something more honest. They'd spent 3 days understanding poverty in its rawest form. Now they needed to understand what it meant to be poor, but not destitute, to have just enough resources to survive, but not enough to be comfortable. That afternoon, they found a real estate agent working in a small office in Jackson Heights, Queens. They told her they were looking for a short-term rental, a month-to-month situation, they emphasized, nothing permanent. The agent, a woman named Svetlana, with a thick Russian accent and the manner of someone who'd seen every possible economic situation, showed them 3 apartments. The first was in a building that appeared to be actively decomposing. The second was in a basement with a window well that looked directly onto the sidewalk. The third was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building that had been recently renovated. It was small, perhaps 400 square feet total, and it cost $800 a month. Everything was institutional beige. Everything was slightly worn, but it was clean and functional, and it had running water and heat. "We'll take it," Victoria said immediately. Svetlana looked between them with the particular expression of someone accustomed to assessing whether people could actually afford their choices. $1,200 deposit, first month's rent, last month's rent. That's $2,800. Marcus and Victoria exchanged a glance. This was the moment where they could either commit to the fiction they'd constructed or retreat to the penthouse. Marcus went to the storage closet at the shelter and retrieved one of the suitcases. He counted out $2,800 in cash and placed it on Svetlana's desk. Svetlana's eyebrows rose slightly, but she said nothing. She prepared the paperwork, and by 5 o'clock that afternoon, they had keys to apartment 304 in a walk-up building in Queens. The apartment was empty, except for the fixtures. A stove, a refrigerator from approximately 1990, a bathroom with pink tile from the 70s. But it had a bed. They bought one that evening from a discount furniture store, along with sheets and blankets and basic kitchen equipment. By 10 o'clock that night, they were lying in their new bed, in their new apartment, in Queens, having spent approximately $3,000 to live like middle-class people with limited resources. Victoria turned to face him in the darkness. "We have 3 more days of this week. What do you want to do with them?" Marcus thought about it. "I want to understand," he said finally. "I want to understand what it means to build something from nothing. Not a business, not a financial empire, but a life. An actual life. We'll need jobs," Victoria said practically. "Permanent ones, or at least stable ones. We can't survive on day labor. So the next day, they began the process of finding work, real work, stable work, the kind of work that wouldn't pay much but would pay regularly, would provide structure, would require them to show up and be present and actually matter to someone other than themselves. The coffee shop was called Grounds for Hope, which Marcus initially assumed was either deeply ironic or a statement about the proprietor's optimism. It occupied a corner space in Jackson Heights, squeezed between a laundromat and a store that sold used electronics. The interior was deliberately ramshackle, mismatched furniture, art on the walls from local artists, a chalkboard menu written in 3 languages. Behind the counter stood a man in his early 60s with kind eyes and the manner of someone who'd made a deliberate choice to exist outside the conventional economy. His name was David Chen, and when Marcus walked in at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning, David was wiping down the espresso machine with the careful attention of someone for whom the work was meditation rather than obligation. "We're looking for work," Marcus said, and the words still felt strange in his mouth, still carried the taste of unreality. "Anything you have. We're reliable. We're willing to learn." David looked up from the espresso machine and studied Marcus with an intensity that suggested he was reading something beyond the surface. After a long moment, he said, "What's your story?" The question was simple and impossible. Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it. The truth, that he was a millionaire pretending to be poor, conducting some elaborate social experiment on his wife, would sound like either a confession or a delusion. But a lie also felt untenable in this space. In front of this man who seemed to operate according to a different set of principles than the ones Marcus had spent 53 years learning. "We're figuring things out," Marcus said finally. "We came to New York thinking we needed to understand something about ourselves. We're discovering we were wrong about most of it." David nodded slowly, as though this was a reasonable answer. "Can you start Monday?" "Yes," Marcus said, "absolutely. 9 in the morning. We open at 7, but you don't need to be here that early yet. I'll show you how to make coffee, how to work the register, how to talk to people. Most of the job is actually talking to people. The coffee is just the vehicle." Victoria got work at the Jackson Heights Public Library, 3 blocks away. The head librarian, a woman named Mrs. Okonkwo with grey in her hair, and a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who'd spent 40 years teaching people how to navigate information systems, hired her to work in the circulation desk, checking books in and out, helping patrons locate resources, maintaining the organizational systems that kept the library functional. "It's not glamorous," Mrs. Okonkwo said, "but it matters. Libraries are where people come when they need to believe that things can get better. It's good work." Victoria started on the same Monday that Marcus began at the coffee shop. They established a routine. They woke at 6 o'clock, shared a quick breakfast in their small kitchen, and walked together to Jackson Heights, where they separated. Marcus turning left toward Grounds for Hope, Victoria continuing straight toward the library. They met again at the end of their shifts, around 5:30 in the afternoon, and they walked together back to their apartment, where they'd cooked dinner using ingredients they bought from the local bodega or the discount supermarket a few blocks away. It was, Marcus realized, what normal people did. This was what the vast majority of the world experienced. Work that was neither particularly glamorous nor particularly terrible. Relationships built through proximity and necessity. The slow accumulation of small routines that added up to something like a life. He had spent 53 years building empires and accumulating symbols of status, and he had been missing this entire dimension of human experience. The first week of working at Grounds for Hope was humbling in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. He couldn't initially remember the difference between a macchiato and a cappuccino. He kept making espresso shots that were either too fast or too slow, resulting in coffee that tasted like burnt earth or hot water. He was awkward with customers, over-explaining the menu, treating simple transactions like they required complex negotiation. But David was patient in a way that suggested infinite reserves of tolerance, and slowly, incrementally, Marcus began to improve. By the third week, he could make a proper cappuccino without having to think through each step. By the fourth week, he was beginning to recognize regular customers and their preferred orders. By the fifth week, they'd extended the experiment beyond the original week, neither of them willing to return to the penthouse. He realized that he actually enjoyed making coffee. There was something meditative about the process, something that required complete presence in a way that financial acquisitions never had. Victoria was experiencing something similar at the library. She'd started by simply checking books in and out, performing the mechanical aspects of the job without engaging deeply with the work. But Mrs. Okonkwo had other ideas. She began giving Victoria small projects, creating a display of books about resilience, helping a young mother find parenting resources, assisting an elderly immigrant man in navigating the computer system to video call his grandchildren in Manila. "What you're doing," Mrs. Okonkwo told her one afternoon, "is connecting people with possibilities. That's the real job. The books are just the medium." Victoria came home on the day Mrs. Okonkwo said this, with tears in her eyes, and Marcus understood that something profound was shifting in his wife. She was being seen, not as a symbol or an accessory, but as a person capable of mattering to others. It was during the sixth week that they met Elena. Marcus was working the morning shift at Grounds for Hope, and the coffee shop was in that liminal space between breakfast rush and lunch, when the customer flow was lighter and the work became less about speed and more about presence. A woman came in around 11 o'clock, pushing a cart filled with what appeared to be her entire life. She was perhaps in her mid-40s, though the details of her face suggested she'd lived hard, lines around her eyes, a thinness that came not from discipline but from insufficient calories, hair that had been various colors at various times, and was currently a dark auburn that didn't quite match her roots. She stood in the doorway of the coffee shop for a long moment, clearly calculating whether she was welcome, whether the implicit message that said "customers only" would be enforced against her. David was counting the till, but he looked up and saw her and smiled. "Come in," he said. "I was just about to make a fresh pot. You should try it. It's Ethiopian, single origin. I just got it in." The woman hesitated, and Marcus saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, the cost versus the benefit, the risk of being thrown out versus the reward of actual coffee. "I don't have much," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "It's on me," David said. "I make too much anyway. It would be a waste." The woman came in and sat at a small table near the window. David made her a coffee with an almost ceremonial care, the kind of attention he usually reserved for the occasional customer who asked for something specific. The woman cradled the cup between her hands as though it were something precious, and she closed her eyes while she sipped it. "It's good," she said finally. "It's really good." Marcus watched this interaction from behind the counter, and something shifted in his understanding of what this place was. Grounds for Hope wasn't a business designed to maximize profit. It was a space designed to provide dignity to people who'd had dignity stripped from them. And David understood this perfectly, understood that providing good coffee to a homeless woman wasn't charity. It was recognition of her basic humanity. The woman came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, she was a regular, arriving around 11 o'clock, sitting at the same table by the window, drinking Ethiopian coffee and reading books that David would leave out for her. Her name was Elena, and she'd been living on the streets of New York City for 3 years. One afternoon, when there was a lull in customers, David asked her how she'd ended up homeless. "Bad choices," Elena said, "or bad luck, probably both. I was a teacher, English, 7th grade, Brooklyn. I had an apartment, I had a job, I had a plan. But the school district had budget cuts and I lost my position. I couldn't find another teaching job, couldn't afford the apartment on part-time work, couldn't get housing assistance because I had savings, and savings meant I didn't qualify. Caught in the gap between poor enough to be homeless and rich enough to not qualify for help. "What happened to your savings?" Marcus asked, surprising himself by asking. "Medical bills," Eleanor said. "I got sick, really sick, infection in my bloodstream, and I didn't have health insurance because my part-time job didn't provide it. 6 weeks in the hospital cost me everything. After that, it was just a slope. Lost the apartment, lost the car, lost the ability to work because I couldn't maintain the hygiene standards required for retail or food service. Now I sleep in a shelter sometimes, on the street other times, and I read books and drink David's excellent coffee and try to figure out how my life became this." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. This woman had been a teacher. She had been part of the world he inhabited, had been contributing to society, had been doing work that mattered. And a single catastrophe, a health crisis that would have been manageable for him, handled through insurance and out-of-pocket expenses that would barely register against his wealth, had displaced her entirely. That evening, he told Victoria about Eleanor. "I want to help her," he said. "I have money, Victoria. I have so much money. I could solve her immediate problems, get her into a hotel, pay for some kind of transitional housing, help her get back on her feet." "With what money?" Victoria asked carefully. "The money in the suitcases?" "Yes." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. They were sitting in their small apartment in Queens, in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the building around them. People moving through spaces, televisions playing, the city's constant low-level noise. Finally, she said, "That's not solving her problem. That's creating temporary relief and obscuring the structural issues that created her situation in the first place." "So what?" Marcus said, frustration rising in his voice. "I'm supposed to just watch her suffer because solving it would be insufficient?" "I'm saying," Victoria said carefully, "that maybe you need to talk to her. Maybe you need to ask her what she actually needs, rather than assuming you know." The next morning, when Elena came in for her coffee, Marcus asked her to sit with him during his break. She looked nervous, as though she'd committed some breach and was about to be expelled from this place that had become important to her. "I wanted to ask you something," Marcus said, sitting across from her. "If you could change anything about your situation, what would it be? Not realistically, not what's possible. What would actually fix things?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I'd go back to teaching. I miss it. I miss the sense that I was doing something that mattered. I miss the kids. I miss the structure. But I can't teach from the street. No shower, no clean clothes, no address, no references. Who's going to hire me?" "What if someone did?" Marcus said. "What if I told you I could help you get housing, help you get some stability, help you figure out how to get back into teaching?" Elena studied him with an intensity that made him understand she was trying to determine if this was some kind of scam or if he was genuinely offering something. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. "Because I'm learning," Marcus said slowly, "that the world looks different depending on where you're standing, and I've realized that I spent a lot of years standing in a place where I didn't have to see the people who were falling through the gaps. And maybe the point of this week, or however long this experiment is going to last, is to change my vision, to start seeing people again." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay, but I'm not going to take charity. If you help me, I work. I figure out what I owe you and I pay it back. That's the only way this works for me." "Okay," Marcus said, "we can do it that way." It took 3 weeks to execute the plan. Marcus retrieved the second suitcase from the shelter's storage closet, the one he and Victoria hadn't yet touched. He and Elena worked together to find a room in a boarding house in Astoria, Queens, paying 3 months in advance. He used some of his remaining cash to buy Elena interview clothes, not expensive, but clean and presentable. He helped her reach out to former colleagues who could serve as references. Victoria researched the requirements for getting recertified to teach in New York State and discovered that Elena's certification had lapsed but could be renewed relatively quickly if she took a short professional development course. By the end of the 8th week of the experiment, which neither of them had discussed ending, neither of them had mentioned returning to the penthouse, Elena had secured a position as a substitute teacher at the middle school where she'd worked before. The position didn't start until January, which gave her time to take the required professional development, to re-establish her documentation, to remember how to exist in the world as a person with an address and a job and a future. On the day she started substitute teaching, she came by Grounds for Hope in the afternoon, still wearing the professional clothes that felt strange after so long on the streets. David made her a special coffee, a new blend he'd been experimenting with, and he handed it to her with a smile that suggested he'd known this outcome was coming all along. "You're going to be great," he said. "Those kids are lucky." After Elena left, Marcus stood behind the counter and felt something settle in his chest. This was what he'd been searching for during those years in the penthouse, the sense that his actions mattered, that his resources could generate actual change in actual people's lives. But he'd been searching in the wrong place, looking for meaning in the accumulation of symbols rather than in connection with people. That evening, as he and Victoria walked home through the early December darkness, she took his hand. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Mrs. Okonkwo offered me a full-time position, head of adult literacy programs. It's not much money, but it's permanent. It has benefits, and it's something I actually want to do." "Are you going to take it?" Marcus asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Yes," Victoria said. "I think I am." They walked in silence for a while, and then Marcus said, "I've been thinking about the penthouse, about the business, about all of it." "And?" Victoria asked carefully. "I don't want to go back," Marcus said. "Not to the penthouse, not to the business, not to the performance. I don't know what comes next, but I know that it can't be that." Victoria squeezed his hand. "So what comes next?" "I don't know," Marcus said honestly, "but maybe that's okay. Maybe we figure it out as we go." When they arrived at their small apartment in Queens, they found an envelope slipped under their door. Inside was a letter from David, written in careful handwriting. "Marcus and Victoria, I know who you are. I've known for several weeks. I didn't say anything because I thought you needed to find your own way to what you're discovering now. The truth is, I was you once. Wealthy, successful, completely disconnected from anything real. I had a heart attack, a minor one, nothing that should have been fatal, but it was enough to make me question everything. I walked away from that life 12 years ago, and I've never regretted it for a single moment. What you're doing with Elena, the way you're showing up at this coffee shop and actually learning the work, the way you're letting your wife become her own person, this matters, not just for them, but for you. I'd like to talk to you both about something. I'm thinking about expanding Grounds for Hope, opening another location, maybe creating a model that could work in other cities. I need partners who understand both the business side and the human side. I need people who know what they're walking away from and why they're walking away from it. Would you consider it?" David Marcus read the letter twice. Then he read it to Victoria, and they sat in the darkness of their small apartment and understood that the experiment wasn't ending. It was transforming. It was becoming something real. The meeting with David happened on a Tuesday evening in late December at a small table in the back of Grounds for Hope after closing. The coffee shop had been decorated with simple garland and paper snowflakes that one of the regular customers, a 7-year-old named Miguel, who came in with his abuela every Saturday, had made and left as gifts. The decorations were humble and slightly crooked, and they transformed the space into something that felt genuinely celebratory rather than commercially festive. David had made a pot of his best coffee, and he laid out the proposal with the kind of systematic clarity that suggested he'd been thinking about this for far longer than the letter had indicated. The business model, he explained, is intentionally anti-capitalist, which I realize sounds naive for someone asking you to be a business partner. But what I mean is that I'm not interested in maximizing profit. I'm interested in maximizing dignity. Every location operates at a modest margin, enough to sustain itself and to eventually open new locations, but not enough to make anyone wealthy. Then why ask us? Victoria asked. She was sitting forward, her elbows on the table, her expression focused in a way that reminded Marcus of the woman she'd been before the experiment, the Victoria who attended board meetings and understood spreadsheets. But this version of her was asking the question differently, from a place of genuine curiosity rather than skeptical interrogation. Because you understand both sides, David said. You know what wealth feels like, what it does to people, how it distances you from meaning. But you're also discovering what it feels like to build something from small resources, to make a genuine difference in actual people's lives. I need people who have walked that line. What would the positions entail? Marcus asked. Victoria would oversee programming, David said. I've seen how she works with people at the library. She has a gift for understanding what people actually need, rather than what we assume they need. You would oversee operations and growth. You understand systems, efficiency, how to scale. But you're also learning. I've watched you these past 2 months, how to scale in a way that preserves the human element. The proposal was for them to each take a salary of $55,000 annually, which was significantly less than what Marcus had been earning before the experiment began. It was approximately what Victoria made at her current position, perhaps slightly less. It was barely middle-class income in New York City, and it would require them to live carefully, to make choices, to understand their resources in a way they hadn't since high school. Marcus looked at Victoria, and he saw his own uncertainty reflected back at him. This was the moment where they could accept David's offer and commit to a fundamentally different life, or they could retrieve the remaining money from the suitcase, return to the penthouse, and resume their previous existence, changed by their experience perhaps, but still fundamentally operating within the world of wealth and privilege. I need to think about it, Marcus said finally. We both do. Of course, David said. Take whatever time you need. The offer will be open until the end of January. After that, I'll need to make other arrangements. They left the coffee shop and walked home through the December night. The weather had turned genuinely cold now, the kind of cold that made the city feel cleaner somehow, sharper. They walked without speaking, their breath visible in the air, their hands occasionally brushing against each other. Back at the apartment, Victoria made tea, a simple herbal blend from the bodega, and they sat by the window, looking out at the street below, where a few people were still moving through their evening. I don't want to go back, Victoria said finally. I want to say it first before you can say it, before we get caught in negotiation. I don't want to go back to the penthouse. I don't want to go back to being a decoration. I don't want to go back to performing my life instead of living it. I don't want to go back either, Marcus said, but I'm terrified. I'm terrified of choosing to be poor when I've spent 53 years being rich. I'm terrified that this will become a different kind of performance. The wealthy couple playing at poverty, pretending they're noble for choosing to live simply. What if we asked Elena? Victoria said suddenly. What if we told her the truth and asked her what she thought? It was a strange idea, but it lodged in Marcus's mind as profound. They'd been so focused on helping Elena that they hadn't thought to ask her opinion on their fundamental life question. They went to the library the next afternoon, and Victoria found Elena in the break room eating lunch, a sandwich she'd made at home, sitting alone, reading a book. When Victoria asked if they could talk, Elena followed her to a small office that Mrs. Okonkwo had designated for private conversations. They told her everything, not in a burst, but carefully, chronologically. The penthouse, the experiment, the suitcases of money, the week pretending to be homeless that had transformed into 2 months of actual integration into a different life. They told her about David's offer and their uncertainty about accepting it. Elena listened without interrupting, and when they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're asking me," she said finally, "if I think you should be poor, if I think wealth is actually evil, and you should reject it as penance." "Something like that," Victoria admitted. "Here's what I think," Elena said. "I think that money isn't evil. Indifference is evil. Ignorance is evil. The belief that the world would be better if poor people just worked harder, that's evil. But money itself, money is just a tool, and I think what matters is what you do with it." She paused, and then continued. "When I was homeless, the things that saved me weren't magical. They were small things, a coffee made with care, a person who saw me as a human being rather than a problem. A chance to teach again. You gave me those things because you cared about whether I survived. That came from you as people, not from your bank account. But the money, your money, gave you the freedom to care about me. If you go back to being rich and indifferent, that's a waste. If you use your resources to build something that helps people while also honoring your own lives, that's not a waste. That's actually meaningful." They decided to accept David's offer with one condition. They wanted to use the remaining money in the second suitcase, approximately $32,000, to establish a fund that would help people transitioning out of homelessness, similar to what had happened with Elena. Not charity, they insisted, but investment in people. People who had jobs lined up but couldn't afford first month's rent. People who needed professional clothes for interviews. People who needed a few months of stable housing to re-establish themselves. David agreed enthusiastically, and he suggested that Victoria oversee the fund's distribution as part of her role at Grounds for Hope. It was a perfect fit. Her gift for understanding what people actually needed would be essential in determining how to allocate resources in a way that generated genuine change rather than temporary relief. They gave notice at the library and at Grounds for Hope, explaining that they were transitioning to a new role. Mrs. Okonkwo seemed unsurprised, as though she'd anticipated Marcus and Victoria's evolution all along. She hugged Victoria goodbye and told her to make sure the literacy programs were thriving. "You understand something that most people never learn," Mrs. Okonkwo said. "You understand that helping people is a privilege, not a burden. That's rare. Don't lose it." The transition happened in early January. Marcus and Victoria moved out of the small apartment in Queens and into a slightly larger apartment that David owned, a 2-bedroom in Astoria, closer to where the new location of Grounds for Hope was being developed. The rent was $600, which was still an adjustment from the penthouse, but represented a significant portion of their new income. The experience of moving was surreal. They had almost no possessions, some clothes, some books, the bed they'd purchased during the experiment, a few kitchen items. Everything else, the years of accumulated wealth objects, they'd left at the penthouse, where the lawyers were managing the transition of property during the divorce proceedings. Yes, divorce. Victoria had filed in early January, and though it was proceeding civilly, they wanted the same things, wanted to separate their lives in a way that honored what they'd both experienced during the experiment. It was still happening. They were not going to stay married, but the friendship that was emerging between them felt more real than any marriage they'd previously shared. "I think," Victoria said one evening, "that we would have divorced anyway, eventually. This just made it clear faster, made it something we could do consciously rather than something that would happen to us." "Do you regret it?" Marcus asked. "The experiment? The whole thing?" "Not for a second," Victoria said. "Do you?" "No," Marcus said. "Though I'm still adjusting to the idea that I'm not going to be wealthy anymore. I'm not going to have the penthouse, the status, the security of knowing I can do whatever I want without thinking about money." "You can still do whatever you want," Victoria pointed out, just differently. You can do things that actually mean something. The grand opening of the second Grounds for Hope location happened on a Saturday in mid-February. The space was in Astoria, on a corner that had previously housed a shuttered electronics store. David had spent the previous 2 months transforming it into something that reflected the same philosophy as the original location. Mismatched furniture, art from local artists, an explicit welcome to anyone who walked through the door. Elena came to the opening, now 3 months into her substitute teaching position, already in the process of applying for permanent positions. She brought Miguel, the 7-year-old who'd made the snowflakes, and his abuela. She brought 2 other people she'd met while homeless, people who'd been part of her survival network, people who now had jobs or were in the process of finding them. The presence of these people, real people who'd been helped not through charity, but through genuine investment in their futures, made the opening feel like something more than just another small business launch. David gave a short speech. Grounds for Hope exists because I believe that dignity is not something that has to be earned through wealth or status. Dignity is a right. It belongs to everyone. This location, like the first, is a space where that belief is practiced, where anyone can come in and be treated as someone who matters, where the coffee is excellent and the welcome is genuine. This wouldn't exist without Marcus and Victoria, who spent 2 months living the reality that most of the world experiences every day. They came here thinking they needed to understand poverty. What they discovered is that they needed to understand humanity. And that understanding is now part of the foundation of this place. Marcus and Victoria stood together at the back of the room, watching the people move through the space. Marcus thought about the penthouse, about the carefully curated art, and the minimalist design that had been created to impress no one but to exist as a monument to his own success. This space, with its crooked furniture and hand-drawn art and genuine welcome, felt more like success than anything he'd ever created before. After the opening, as people were filtering out, Elena approached them. I got offered a permanent teaching position, she said, full-time starting in March. Benefits and everything. I'm going to accept it. That's wonderful, Victoria said, hugging her. It's because of you, Elena said firmly. Both of you. You believed I could do it. And that belief was the thing that made it possible. So thank you. After Elena left, Marcus and Victoria finished closing the shop. They wiped down the counters, counted the till and locked the door. As they walked home through the Astoria darkness, Marcus took Victoria's hand. I've been thinking, he said, about what comes next, after the divorce is finalized, after all the legal stuff settles. And, Victoria asked. I was thinking, Marcus said carefully, that maybe we could talk about what happens between us, not as a married couple, but as partners, as people who've been through something together and might want to keep building something together, just differently. Victoria squeezed his hand. I'd like that, she said. I'd like that very much. They walked home in silence, and Marcus felt something settle in his chest that he'd never felt before. It wasn't the satisfaction of a successful acquisition or the pleasure of accumulation. It was something deeper and simpler, the sense that he was building a life instead of performing one, that he was connected to other people not through transactions, but through genuine, reciprocal care. The second suitcase was now empty. The money had been distributed, had transformed into housing and hope and second chances for people who'd been written off by systems that valued efficiency over humanity. And in its place, Marcus had accumulated something far more valuable than wealth. He had accumulated purpose. He had accumulated understanding. He had accumulated the knowledge of what it felt like to matter. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of the Astoria apartment, which no longer looked quite like the modest rental it had been 2 years ago. The walls were painted a soft sage green that Victoria had chosen, and the kitchen had been equipped with better equipment, not fancy but functional. A used espresso machine sat on the counter, a gift from David when the first Grounds for Hope location had become profitable enough to justify the expense. The refrigerator was covered with photographs. Elena teaching a class, Miguel at his 8th birthday party, various customers and employees from the 2 coffee shop locations, a picture of Marcus and Victoria at a community garden event they'd helped organize in Jackson Heights. Marcus was making breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, nothing elaborate, while Victoria sat at the small table reading the morning news on her phone. This was their Saturday routine now. No alarm clocks, no performance, just the quiet ritual of 2 people who'd learned to exist together without the burden of pretense. "The library is getting a new grant," Victoria said, looking up from her phone. $300,000 for adult literacy programs. Mrs. Okonkwo is going to expand the program significantly. She wants me to help coordinate the expansion. "Are you going to do it?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," Victoria said. "It means more hours, but it's important work. And the compensation is fair enough that it won't strain the budget." This was the kind of conversation they had now, practical, collaborative, focused on impact rather than status. Marcus brought the eggs and toast to the table, and they ate together, discussing the week ahead. He had 2 shifts at Grounds for Hope scheduled, meetings with David about a potential 3rd location in Washington Heights, and a community board meeting about the affordable housing initiative he'd become involved with. Their lives had become structured around work that mattered and relationships that felt genuine. The penthouse was a receding memory, something that had happened to someone else. The divorce had been finalized 14 months ago, and they'd each signed the necessary papers with a sense of relief rather than loss. They were no longer legally married, but they'd never been more genuinely partnered. Elena arrived at the apartment at 9 o'clock that Saturday morning. She'd become a regular presence in their lives, not quite a roommate, but close enough that she had her own key and knew where everything was. Her teaching position had become permanent after her first year, and she was now part of a small group of educators at her school, working to develop curriculum that centered the experiences and perspectives of students from low-income backgrounds. "I brought bagels," Elena announced, holding up a bag from the neighborhood bagel shop. "And I have news." They sat around the small table, the same table where Marcus and Victoria had made their decision to accept David's offer, where they'd cried and laughed and slowly emerged into this new version of their lives. And Eleanor told them about the book deal. She'd written a memoir about her experience of homelessness and her journey back to teaching. She'd started writing it almost by accident, as a way of processing her experience, and she'd shown it to a friend who'd shown it to someone who knew someone in publishing. Now, 18 months later, she had a contract with a small but respected press, and the book was being edited for publication. "The advance isn't much," Elena said, "but it's enough that I can take a semester off to finish the manuscript and do the promotion. And more importantly, it means that my story, the kind of story that usually gets erased, is going to be part of the public record. People are going to read about what it's actually like to be one crisis away from homelessness. People are going to understand that I'm not an exception or a failure. I'm just someone who happened to experience circumstances that most people are actually quite close to experiencing themselves." Victoria reached across the table and squeezed Elena's hand. "We're so proud of you." "I wouldn't be here without you," Eleanor said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she'd rehearsed this, that she needed to say it clearly so that they would understand the depths of her gratitude. "I would probably be dead. I'm not being dramatic, I'm being literal. The sequence of events, the timing, the fact that you 2 happened to be in that coffee shop on the day that you did, that David decided to give you a chance, that all of that aligned in a way that pulled me back from the edge. I'm alive because of you, and I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to understand that what you did wasn't theoretical. It was actual. It was life-saving." That afternoon, they went to visit David at the first Grounds for Hope location. The original coffee shop had been expanded slightly. They'd taken over the adjacent space and transformed it into a small library and meeting room, a place where people could sit and think and plan and exist without being expected to purchase anything to justify their presence. David was behind the counter, and despite being in his mid-60s now, he looked younger than he had 2 years ago, as though the act of building something meaningful was keeping him alive in a way that wealth never could. "How's the book coming?" David asked Elena, making her a coffee without asking what she wanted. He'd memorized her preferences years ago. "Nearly finished," Elena said. "It's strange reading my own words, seeing my story reflected back at me. It makes it feel real in a way that just living through it didn't." David nodded, and then he turned to Marcus and Victoria. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said. "There's been interest in the model from other cities, Philadelphia, Boston, Los Angeles. People who want to replicate what we've built, but with their own local context. I've been thinking about establishing a non-profit organization that could oversee multiple locations, provide training for new partners, develop the curriculum and philosophy in a way that could work at scale, but without losing the fundamental commitment to dignity and genuine impact." He paused, and Marcus understood that this was a question disguised as a statement. "Are you asking us to help lead that?" Marcus asked. "I'm asking if you'd be interested," David said. "It would mean Victoria stepping back from the day-to-day work at the library, at least partially. It would mean you, Marcus, moving into a more strategic role. It would mean traveling, which you haven't done much of in the past 2 years. But it would also mean that the model we've developed here could scale in a way that actually helps more people." Marcus and Victoria exchanged a glance, and without speaking, they communicated something to each other, the particular language that long partnership, even when that partnership was no longer romantic, created between two people. "We'd need to think about it," Victoria said. "We'd need to understand what it would mean for our lives here, for the commitments we've made. But yes, we're interested." Over the next several weeks, they did think about it. They talked to Mrs. Okonkwo, who offered to manage the literacy program independently for a period, giving Victoria time to develop the non-profit structure. They talked to Elena, who offered their apartment as a base whenever they were in the city, establishing herself as a kind of anchor to their life in New York. They talked to various community members, people whose lives had been touched by Grounds for Hope, people who understood the model and its importance. By the end of March, they'd made their decision. They would accept David's offer, with the understanding that they would spend approximately 1 week of every month in New York, maintaining their presence and their commitments to the communities they'd become part of. The rest of the time would be spent traveling, meeting with potential partners in other cities, developing training materials, ensuring that Grounds for Hope could expand without losing its soul. It was, Marcus realized, the kind of work he should have been doing all along. The kind of work that required his strategic mind and his understanding of systems, but in service of something that actually mattered. The kind of work that generated genuine change rather than just accumulation. 2 months into the expansion work, Marcus was in Philadelphia, meeting with a woman named Rebecca, who ran a community center and was interested in opening a Grounds for Hope location in her neighborhood. They were sitting in her office, reviewing the business model and the philosophy behind it, when Rebecca said something that stopped him. "I have to ask," she said, "why do you care about this? You have the bearing of a man who could be doing something far more lucrative, far more prestigious. What brought you to this work?" Marcus considered the question. 2 years ago, he would have given an answer designed to demonstrate his humility and his commitment to social justice, a performance of caring designed to enhance his image. But that was not who he was anymore. "I was empty," he said finally. "I had everything that society told me would make me happy, money, status, success, and I was profoundly, achingly empty. I discovered that I'd spent 53 years building something that was fundamentally hollow. This work, helping people understand their own worth, creating spaces where dignity is not something that has to be earned, this is what fills that emptiness. This is what actually matters. Rebecca nodded slowly. My grandmother was homeless, she said. For 6 months after my grandfather died, she lost the apartment and she lived on the street. She eventually got back on her feet, but she never recovered from the shame of it, never recovered from the feeling that she'd failed. She died thinking she was less than because of those 6 months. If there had been a space like what you're describing, a space where her dignity wasn't contingent on her housing status, I think it might have saved her life. Not literally, but spiritually. She might have lived differently. This was why they did it, Marcus understood. This was why he'd walked away from the penthouse and the business and everything he'd spent 5 decades accumulating. Because somewhere in the world, there was someone like Rebecca's grandmother, someone whose humanity had been reduced to their economic circumstances, and the work they were doing suggested to the world that that reduction was a lie. That dignity belonged to everyone, regardless of their bank account. By the 1-year anniversary of the expansion project, Grounds for Hope had 3 locations in New York and 1 each in Philadelphia and Boston. David was developing locations in Los Angeles and Chicago. The non-profit structure was established with a board that included not just Marcus and Victoria and David, but also Elena and several people who'd been homeless or were currently experiencing housing insecurity, ensuring that the voices of the people most affected by the model's outcomes remained central to the organization's decision-making. The statistics were modest but real. Over 200 people had been helped through the transitional fund that Victoria oversaw. Approximately 30 had secured permanent housing and stable employment. Elena's book had been published and had gotten genuine critical attention, particularly for its unsparing look at the systems that create and perpetuate homelessness. 3 of the locations had generated enough profit to open a 4th location without requiring capital investment from external sources. But what mattered more than the statistics was the day-to-day reality. It was the moment when a young woman who'd been sleeping in a shelter came into a Grounds for Hope location, and someone took the time to help her access resources. It was the fact that Elena was standing in front of a classroom full of young people, teaching them literature and composition and the dangerous idea that their stories mattered. It was the knowledge that Marcus and Victoria's choice to walk away from wealth had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond themselves. On the 2-year anniversary of the day Marcus had first walked into the penthouse with the 2 suitcases of money, he and Victoria stood in the 3rd Grounds for Hope location in New York, watching the evening crowd filter in. It was autumn again, the same season they'd begun this journey, and the light was that particular October gold that made even the city's rough edges seem beautiful. Do you ever regret it? Victoria asked. The same question she'd asked him before, the question that had become a kind of refrain in their relationship. Not for a second, Marcus said. Do you? No, Victoria said. Though sometimes I miss the simplicity of the penthouse, the ease of it. Do you miss being empty? Marcus asked gently. Victoria considered this. No, she said finally. No, I don't miss that at all. Eleanor came in, as she often did on Friday evenings, and she brought with her one of her students, a young man named Carlos, who'd been struggling with his classes and who Eleanor had been mentoring. Elena had suggested to David that Grounds for Hope might want to develop a tutoring program, and David had agreed, transforming part of the library space into a study area where high school students could get help with their coursework. Carlos ordered a coffee and sat down at one of the tables, opening his textbook, beginning to work on his essay. Elena sat across from him, discussing symbolism in literature, helping him understand that his ideas mattered, that the work he was doing had value. And watching this interaction, Marcus felt something settle in his chest that he'd never felt in all his years of financial success. the sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. At closing time, as Marcus and Victoria were wiping down the counters, David came out of the office with a letter in his hand. "This came in today," David said. "It's from the city. They're establishing a new category of business licensing that prioritizes community impact over profit. They're offering tax incentives for businesses that meet certain criteria. Based on everything we're doing, we qualify. It means we can expand faster, open more locations, help more people." Marcus took the letter and read it, and he felt something that he recognized from his old life. The thrill of success, of systems aligning, of momentum building in a direction he was choosing. But it was different now. It was success measured not in dollars accumulated, but in lives changed. It was momentum in service of something that mattered. "This is good," Marcus said. "This is really good." "It's because of you two," David said. "You brought something to this work that I didn't have. You brought the understanding that comes from having lived on both sides of the economic divide. You brought the knowledge of what it means to choose differently, to walk away from what you were expected to be, and figure out who you actually are." After David left, Marcus and Victoria finished closing the shop. They locked the door and stepped out into the October night, and they walked home through the streets of New York, through the neighborhoods they now inhabited, past the people they now knew, toward the apartment that was now home. "I've been thinking," Victoria said, "about the future. About what happens next after we finish the expansion, after we've established the model in the cities we're targeting." "And?" Marcus asked. "I want to think about going back to school," Victoria said. "I want to get a degree in education policy. I want to understand, at a systemic level, how to create the kind of change that would make organizations like ours unnecessary, because the systems themselves would have changed." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. This was who Victoria had become, a woman who discovered her own intelligence, her own agency, her own ability to shape the world around her. She was no longer content with small-scale intervention. She was thinking about the structures that created the need for intervention in the first place. "That's brilliant," he said. "What about you?" Victoria asked. "What do you want to do?" Marcus considered the question. A year ago, he might have talked about opening more locations, about scaling the model internationally, about building something bigger and bigger until it filled the horizon. But he'd learned that the biggest changes didn't come from the biggest projects. "I want to keep doing what I'm doing," he said. "I want to be present at the locations, to keep learning from the people who come through the doors, to help develop the training and the philosophy. I think that's what I'm actually good at. Not the big vision, but the implementation, the human infrastructure, the day-to-day work of making something real." They walked home in companionable silence, and when they arrived at the apartment, they found Elena waiting for them with a bottle of wine and 3 glasses. "Celebration," she announced. "I got the teaching award. Full-year fellowship to develop curriculum for underrepresented voices in literature. The school is giving me a sabbatical to work on it." They sat in the small kitchen in the apartment that had become their home, and they drank wine and talked about the future. Not a future that looked like the past, not wealth and status and performance, but a future that looked like work that mattered, relationships that were genuine, the slow and gradual discovery of what it meant to be human in a world that constantly tried to reduce you to your economic value. At midnight, as Elena was leaving and Marcus and Victoria were getting ready for bed, Victoria said something that had been on her mind for a while. "I've been thinking about writing something," she said. "Not a book like Elena, but something. An essay or an article about what it felt like to be wealthy and empty, and what it felt like to choose less and discover more. Do you think anyone would want to read that?" "I think," Marcus said, "that people need to read that. I think people need to understand that the equation they've been taught, that more money equals more happiness, is a lie. I think your story could change someone's life." Victoria smiled, And Marcus saw in that smile the woman she'd been becoming ever since they'd walked out of the penthouse 2 years ago. She was confident now, not in the brittle way that wealth and status created, but in the deeper way that came from knowing your own worth, independent of external validation. They fell asleep together in the narrow bed in the small apartment, and Marcus dreamed of the penthouse, but it was a dream without longing, without regret. He dreamed of it the way one might dream of a place one had visited once, and found curious, but ultimately unremarkable. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Grounds for Hope non-profit organization was now operating in 12 cities across the United States. The model had been replicated and adapted, contextualized to different communities while maintaining the core philosophy. That dignity is not something that has to be earned, that every person has value regardless of their economic circumstances, that building community is more important than maximizing profit. Marcus and Victoria were no longer together as partners. They'd formalized that 3 years ago, but they remained central to the organization's operations. Marcus had developed a certification program that trained new managers in the philosophy and operations of Grounds for Hope locations. Victoria had completed her degree in education policy and was now consulting with local government organizations on policy changes designed to address homelessness from the systemic level rather than the individual crisis level. Elena's book had been adapted into a documentary that had premiered at Sundance and was now available on multiple streaming platforms. She had moved into advocacy work, using her platform to highlight the ways that homelessness was not a personal failure, but a systemic creation. She maintained an apartment in New York, in the same neighborhood where she'd first met Marcus and Victoria, and she served as a board member for Grounds for Hope, ensuring that the voices of people with lived experience of homelessness remained central to the organization's decision-making. David, now in his early 70s, had stepped back from day-to-day operations but remained the organization's spiritual and philosophical anchor. He spent his time traveling between locations, consulting with new partners, ensuring that the core values remained intact even as the organization expanded. The 2 suitcases that had started this entire journey were kept in a safe at the main office, empty now but preserved as a kind of artifact. A reminder of the moment when Marcus Wellington had decided that his life needed to mean something. On an October evening, 5 years to the day after he'd walked into the penthouse with those suitcases, Marcus sat in a Grounds for Hope location in Los Angeles, watching the evening crowd. A young woman was working behind the counter, training to become a manager. A young man was sitting at a table, studying for his GED, using the free resources that the location provided. An older woman was reading a book, using the space as a quiet refuge from the chaos of the street, and Marcus understood with absolute clarity that he'd found what he'd been searching for all those years in the penthouse. Not happiness, that seemed too simple a word, but meaning, purpose, connection. The knowledge that his life mattered not because of what he'd accumulated, but because of what he'd contributed to the lives of people he would never fully know. He took out his phone and sent a text to Victoria. Just watched a woman get her first real job because she came into this location and someone believed in her. This is why we did it. Victoria's response came back almost immediately. This is why we'll keep doing it. And as the evening deepened and the coffee shop filled with the particular mix of humanity that Grounds for Hope was designed to welcome, people sleeping on streets by choice or circumstance, people working minimum wage jobs, students, artists, older people, younger people, the entire spectrum of human experience that the world's systems tried to make invisible, Marcus felt something he'd never felt. In the penthouse. He felt like he was home. What did you think of the story? Share your opinion in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What was your score? subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to follow all our stories and have fun.